morning, everybody, and welcome to the 2020 Tri-State SHRM virtual meeting. My session is the Higher Image 2020 Background Eye Screening. I am Cunneen, CEO of Higher Image, a nationally accredited background screening company out of Rhode Island. Missing the fact that I'm there with all of you in person, as I'm sure all of you are feeling the same way too, but hopefully you've enjoyed the virtual conference so far, and hopefully you learn a lot today at our session. During this session, I encourage you to engage with me. Let's connect in a chat session. I will be live in that chat session answering your questions as you post them. I'm happy to answer any of those questions. And then, of course, if you ever have a question outside of when you log out today, I'm also available, and my contact information will be at the end of the slide presentation. But please engage on the chat section there, and I will be answering your question. All right, well, let's get started. I'm going to turn off my webcam so you guys can see what's happening here, and I'm not in your way. Get it, the C thing here. We're going with the whole I theme. Again, I'm Cunneen. I used to chair the National Association of Professional Background Screeners, just by way of a little background on why maybe I know what I'm doing here. And it's now called the Professional Background Screening Association, and it's to reflect the more global nature of the organization. Still actively involved, especially with the government relations side of things. So happy to help out anytime you have any questions, really at the kind of heart of what we do in background screening. I'm on top of things, constantly in touch with attorneys that specialize in this area as well. All right. Before we get started, I always have to start with knowledge is power. Although I cannot provide legal advice and that no specific legal advice will be provided today, it really is important for you to understand, although this is a general understanding, don't ever feel like you can't question whether it's your background screening provider or your in-house counsel. We have had times where attorneys might think that they understand the background screening laws, but it is such a specific statute that there's a lot to know about it. So if you're hearing something and something doesn't sound right, please question it. That's why you're here today, is to learn, right? So knowledge is power. All right, well, if we were together, I had a nice game planned for all of us with, you know, kind of using Vision 2020. I was so excited going into 2020 with the whole vision, and I had my strategic planning and all of that. I thought, oh, wouldn't that be great for conferences to present something, you know, in the past, if some of you have seen me speak, I've done a Jeopardy game. I like kind of the games and the audience participation. Unfortunately, we don't have that here, but I'm still going to kind of keep the theme because that's what we had submitted, but I had to pivot, change it around a little bit. But basically what we're going to do here is read off the vision board here and pick a line and ask to kind of go over that. So we're going to start with what we can avoid right now. We probably all wish we could, and part of the reason we're doing this virtual is because of it. So line 5 with COVID. So let's start there. All right, so what's happened now with COVID, and how has it impacted your background screening? I know it's impacted every facet of not only your work life, but your personal life. But you know, today we'll cover a little bit of how it really has impacted you in your background screening, your drug screening, what we're seeing happening out there. I'll start off with some practical implications and what we have seen happen. Let's start with the court closures, which by the time you're listening to this, hopefully we have more and more courts open. I have a feeling we're going to kind of do a start and stop a little bit with some of these courts. So basically, you know, with the courthouses, you know, because everybody went into lockdown mode, courts closed. As many of you, you know, hopefully know with your background screening providers, we have court runners that actually go into courthouses and look up these cases to see if your person has a record or not a record. There are some courts that have gone to a subscription model. So somebody like a Higher Image or another background screening provider can apply and do those searches online, which makes it much more efficient. But some courts have not gone that way. I will tell you, Massachusetts was one of the tougher courts throughout this pandemic with trying to get those court records at the local courthouses, because they do not make it easy. For those of you that are doing Massachusetts county searches, you probably have recognized that. If you're doing the CORI search, we're going to talk about that in a minute. But with the court closures, we're kind of in a little bit of a pickle, you know, how do you get the information? I know Higher Image, we pivoted there as well, and really worked some different areas and avenues to try to get those searches done. In some jurisdictions, I will tell you in Massachusetts, some we actually went a little faster, some a little slower, or sometimes we did get through to a court person. They said that person has way too many records. We're not going to give that to you. There's just way too many. So we found a lot of kind of just quirky things that have come up with the different courthouses, but we're seeing a lot more of those open. Hopefully you're seeing that as well, but deciding how you're treating it, and I'll cover that in a minute there on what happens if you didn't get your searches back, and how does that look. As far as school closures, we saw that as well. Obviously, everything shut down, including the schools. A lot of the universities still had staff that were available via fax or email, and then also a lot of them use a kind of database clearinghouse. So we were able to get most of those college degrees still verified. High schools were a problem, however. We did find a lot of difficulties with those. Not sure how your providers were handling it. I know for Higher Image, we just made it a COVID-19 list, and we just kept trying to get through to those schools. We have gotten, I think we're up to about 88% of those schools have returned the information now, so that's good news, and still working on those few that maybe are stragglers. Business closures, same thing, right? A lot of businesses were closed. Nobody was there to do the employment verification. I will say we have gotten 98% of those that weren't answering due to that, but obviously you have some businesses that unfortunately are just remaining closed. So that's been a little tricky. So I'm sure you've all experienced that, and hopefully, you know, with the reopening of the economy, we don't go back to a full halt of everything, and don't see this ever happen again. But and hopefully we get a a vaccine so we can keep in business here, right? But practically, you know, what you as the employer, what are you to do, right? Like, how do you hire during this? And I'll get into a little bit with the drug testing too in a minute. But, you know, should you wait to hire the person if you don't have the background check back yet? Or should you just move forward? Should you say it's pending the background check and let them start? Those are all things kind of, you got to talk to your legal counsel about. Maybe also talk to your provider. I know with us, it's like if there was something we were waiting on, sometimes we knew what we were waiting on. We just didn't have the details on if it's reportable or not. Sometimes it wasn't as major of an issue or not, but kind of talking to your provider, talking to your in-house counsel, maybe changing your background screening policy just for the interim during COVID-19 while the courts are closed. And then, you know, just kind of what's the disqualifying information that is returned, that if they started working, how are you going to handle that? Are you just going to have them leave that day? I will remind everybody, and I'll get into a little bit more here later on the Fair Credit Reporting Act and what the process is. You still, while COVID's going on, have to follow the two-step adverse action process. So giving them the pre-adverse notification where they have a chance to dispute it, and then that secondary notice. So if they're already started at the job and then you find out there's a criminal record and you no longer want to work with them, you still have to give them that opportunity. So, you know, some lawyers will say, well, then just tell them not to come into work, but you should still pay them. Some attorneys have said you don't have to pay them, but again, that would be a discussion with your in-house counsel to discuss how that would have been handled. And that goes for any time maybe you started working with somebody before you fully got the result back. Rescreening employees returning from furlough, that's been a question that's come up. I've had attorneys say, hey, you don't have to because they remained your employee. They were just furloughed. They're still considered an employee. What I will say to folks, and we haven't seen, actually, we haven't seen any employers that have rescreened employees, but I will tell you, if you are a company that is contractually bound to do background checks, you may want to look at what your contract says. So if they haven't been working for you for 30 days, 60 days, 90, whatever that contract requires, just check to that. We work with many call centers and such that, you know, we would suggest you look at that. All right, other considerations and things that have come up over this is the Mass CORI. Since we're in this tri-state area, many of you are in Massachusetts, many of you are running the CORI, which is the statewide version of the background check from the Massachusetts State Department of Justice. So those of you who are running it, you know you are because you had to register individually. Even if you're using Higher Image or another background screening provider, you have to register, you have to have a CORI policy. The nice thing, well, I wouldn't say it's that nice, but during this pandemic, they did sign an order that allows you to do the mass CORI search without physically seeing the documents of your applicant. So those of you that understand and have been doing CORI searches, you know that it's not an electronic process. We can have an electronic form, but somebody has to physically sign off that they saw the license, they saw the person. But they did say that that can be held off until the state of Massachusetts is no longer in a state of emergency. But then at that time, you, the employer, are required to then see that documentation and sign off on it. So don't think it's now, hey, you got away with that, you didn't have to do it. The way that executive order reads, you do have to go back and then see the documents live. So please don't forget that if you're in Massachusetts. All right. The other area that came up is the I-9, which, gosh, through the National Association, or now the Professional Background Screening Association, we've been working, with the federal government to try to make a more electronic process, friendly process with the I-9 compliance. It's not there yet. Luckily, they noticed, they had to do something during this pandemic, because you couldn't necessarily see the person or get their, right now you're probably getting it notarized if the person is a remote employee to begin with. But what they came out with is you too can do it, virtually. You can see the documents, you can sign off, and just write the reason that you didn't see it in person. Just write the COVID-19. I have a whole area on our website that we show you the steps and how the I-9 should actually physically look. Happy to share that with you. But again, similar to the mass CORI, you have to go back and you have to affirm that you saw the paperwork once we're kind of back in business here and everything is opened up. So don't forget that either on your I-9 compliance. I know that's always a big part of your job, making sure those folders and your I-9 or however you're tracking it is in order. So make sure anyone you did hire throughout this pandemic that you go back and physically see those documents. We also saw a lot of labs are requiring folks to wear masks. We've even had folks that would show up at a lab and the lab, nobody would be there. We've had applicants who refused to get tested because they were afraid they would get COVID, that the testing was happening at the labs. I will tell you, no testing happened at those labs. So in those labs, I'm talking about when you're going for urinalysis, drug test, whether it be Quest or LabCorp or one of the other labs you may be using, they were not doing the COVID-19 test there, so you didn't have that problem. It was kind of as safe as any other place in public that you would go while wearing your mask, but they were requiring you to wear a mask. We even had some instances, where we'd have applicants show up and they just had nobody to work, or nobody was in that office. So that has calmed down now too, so we're not seeing that being a problem. So hopefully we're past the worst of it. All right, so other guidance, the DOT also issued guidance on the drug and alcohol testing for federally regulated transportation workers. They noted that the compliance with its regulations might be challenging due to the lack of resources during the pandemic time, but they wanted you to make a reasonable effort to locate the resources. And if after you had those reasonable efforts and you couldn't locate a resource, the DOT regulated employer must document why the test was not completed, and if under DOT requirements, testing can be conducted at a later date. But very important. So although maybe you could push off the testing, that employee then could not perform any safety sensitive functions until the testing was complete. And at this point, hopefully that's no longer an issue and you've had all those tests done, but they did kind of say, hey, we understand. So I would say this more would happen in those of you who are doing random testing, if someone couldn't go right then, pushing off the random testing a little bit. But for that pre-employment screening, those of you knowing you have to have the DOT test, you have to get that done before they're going to be working in that safety sensitive position. All right, the EEOC also came out with a couple of things during this pandemic for you to be aware of. Most recently, they came out with guidance saying, you know what, employers, you cannot test workers or require workers to be tested for the antibody test. So you are, as an employer, allowed to have them be tested or to test folks to see if they have an active virus, but you can't check for antibodies. So please be aware of that. I know, we even had a webinar with our oral fluid folks and said that, there is a test coming out, hopefully by the end of August here. But again, you can't really use that now as an employer. The EEOC has come out and said you cannot test for antibodies, which they said it would, violate ADA. But what they also had come out with was another ruling saying, guidance, I should say. They updated, they have like kind of pandemic preparedness. They have a whole document. They added questions. So you can refuse to work with someone if they were positive, if you needed somebody to work right then and there. So they did have that outlined in a pandemic preparedness document from the EEOC. So take a look at that if you are having any issues there. All right, some other guidance that came out just recently from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So they're kind of like our big brother in the background screening industry. We're considered consumer reporting agencies. And so that's what that CRA stands for there. Our industry, again, was working with them because we found out that there was a lot of folks who would dispute their record. If they had a criminal record, they would dispute it. It was almost like there was some sort of chat group out there, and this was happening to a lot of the larger firms. Fortunately for us, we didn't have any disputes or anything that related to this, but we had heard out in the industry that there was almost like an influx of disputes. But with courts being closed, how can the Consumer Reporting Agency or the background screener, how could they verify or re-verify that record with the court system? And under the law, we only have 30 days. So what are we to do? So they did come out with guidance, and their key takeaways include, that they're addressing the reinvestigations that the background screener would have to do on a case-by-case basis. So as long as there was a good faith effort, that was okay, because that was troublesome. You had people with criminal records that are like, hey, I can get around this and just say I don't have it, and the background screener is going to take it away because they can't verify it. But they did mention the importance of documenting all the efforts that went into that reinvestigation. So again, hopefully your background screener didn't, have any disputes that had come up with your applicants. But if so, just know documentation is important there.